Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really very appreciative of being able to share some IEA insights into the role of CCUS in net zero pathways, and also to provide a sense of some recent global developments. Let me just get my presentation up. Hopefully you can see this okay. Hopefully that's in the right format for you. So I just want to highlight that, of course, CCUS technologies and CCUS projects are not necessarily new. We have had CCUS projects operating predominantly in the United States since the 1970s and 1980s. Primarily, the CCUS activities have been associated with natural gas processing. That's because this is a relatively low-cost opportunity for CCUS. But you can see that over time, we've developed a more diverse portfolio of projects that are currently operating. So today we have CCUS applied to commercial facilities that are producing hydrogen, that are producing power generation, chemicals, fertilizers, bioethanol, for example. And you can also see that although overall CCUS deployment really hasn't quite met expectations, there has been significant progress just in the last decade or since 2010 with a tripling of the amount of CO2 that's being captured. So as we already heard today, the operating projects around the world have potential, have capacity to capture more than 40 million tonnes of CO2 each year. Looking more at the investment interest and the pipeline of projects here, I'm showing you.
Sorry, Samantha, can you please squeeze your screen or squeeze your presentation, because we cannot see the left part? Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Can you see now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. So I'll go back. Did you see that? So that was the screen in case you're missing it. Okay, and looking at the pipeline of projects that are in development, there has been interest in developing CCUS projects for some time. You can see the operating projects are in the light blue, and there's been a steady increase in operating projects over time. But overall, the interest in investing in CCUS projects and the number of projects in development really has declined between 2012 and 2017. And we just started seeing an uptick in interest from 2018. But I want to particularly highlight the significant increase that we've seen in CCUS investment just in the last year and a year or two. So last year alone, we saw plans for more than 100 projects being announced around the world. This is obviously a very significant departure from previous years, and we've identified really three key factors that are driving this interest in CCUS now. First and foremost is really strengthen climate goals and net zero targets. There's a realization and an appreciation that CCUS is really an important part of the portfolio of solutions and measures that will need to be adopted to meet net zero goals. Secondly, we've seen an improved investment environment in several regions, particularly in the United States. There's already been mention of the 45Q tax credit, which provides currently $50 per tonne of CO2 stored, or $35 per tonne for CO2 used in enhanced oil recovery. This tax credit was actually expanded and updated in 2018. I think this is one of the key milestones that's really contributed to this uptake in project investment plans. But the third key factor that we see is really also this interest in developing hydrogen and a role for hydrogen in net zero pathways. And CCUS, of course, can be an important way of producing hydrogen, and I'll speak about this more in a moment. So looking at sort of where the interest is for this current project pipeline, you can see it's very much concentrated here in the United States and in Europe. This is reflecting where investment incentives are in place. So that includes the tax credit as well as substantial now capital funding for CCUS in the United States. But also in Europe, we're seeing higher emissions trading or carbon pricing, as well as targeted support from countries like Norway, the Netherlands, for example, to invest in CCUS projects. And in terms of where CCUS is being deployed, I think often we talk about CCUS as though it's a coal technology, or it's a coal-fired power technology, or just a power technology, but of course it has a range of applications. So in terms of the projects that are coming forward, many of them are actually in the industrial sector, so cement, steel, chemicals, for example. There's significant interest in hydrogen that I've already mentioned, so this is driving a lot of project interest, as well as new technologies such as direct air capture. So touching now on how we see the role of CCUS in net zero pathways, last year the IEA released a detailed roadmap for the global energy sector to reach net zero by 2050. In this roadmap, CCUS plays a very important and diverse role as part of a range of solutions. So we see CCUS growing from this sort of 40 million tonnes of CO2 being captured each year to more than 7.6 billion tonnes by 2050. So a very significant scale up. And why do we see this significant role for CCUS? There are really four key roles for the technology. First is retrofitting existing power and industrial plants, recognizing that much of our power or industrial assets and infrastructure are really only recently being built. And for these young assets, retrofitting CCUS can be an important solution to enable the assets to continue to operate and contribute to energy security, contribute to economic development goals, but in a way that's consistent with climate targets. The second key role is in industrial applications, where CCUS is one of either limited or is the only solution for deep decarbonisation. That includes in the cement sector, where much of the emissions from cement are actually process related, so they don't come from the burning of fossil fuels. They're actually just inherent in the process of making cement. And the only solution we currently have is physically capturing those emissions and storing them. And the cement sector alone contributes around 7% of global CO2 emissions. So this is a significant role for CCUS. The third key role for CCUS is really around this hydrogen production. It can be a least cost pathway to really scale up the availability of low carbon hydrogen production, which we of course also see as playing an important role in terms of future energy systems. And finally, we've already heard quite a bit about carbon removal. So CCUS technologies really underpin these technology-based approaches to carbon removal through direct air capture with storage and bioenergy with storage. In our model, we rely only on technology-based removals to achieve net zero. And by 2050, we have around almost 2 billion tonnes of CO2 being removed across the energy system through these technologies. And over the course of our scenario, the role of CCUS really changes. So you can see a growing role in industry, a growing role for removal and direct air capture, while in the early years, we focus more on the retrofit opportunity. I want to just touch on the cost aspect of CCUS and highlight that in our analysis, CCUS is part of a least cost pathway to achieving net zero. And there's no one particular cost for CCUS. So we often hear CCUS is very expensive, but there are a range of costs because there are a range of applications for CCUS. And the cost of CCUS is very much determined by the concentration of the CO2 in the stream from which you're trying to capture. So that can be as low as $15 to $25 per tonne of CO2, where you have a very high concentration of CO2. So that can be natural gas processing, coal to chemicals. And then the costs gradually increase as you target more dilute streams. So whether that's iron and steel, cement, power generation. And of course, if you go to direct air capture, this is the most dilute opportunity to capture CO2. So it's also among the most energy intensive and expensive. But I would also highlight that for many of these industrial applications of CCUS, CCUS is still at an early stage of commercialization, and we do see strong opportunities and strong potential for cost reductions through learning by doing, through scaling up infrastructure and economies of scale. So there is significant potential to reduce these costs. One of the key trends, I think, that we've seen in the last few years in terms of CCUS deployment that can also have a very significant impact on costs is moving from considering CCUS as being one standalone facility with its own pipeline and its own storage site to investing in industrial clusters and shared infrastructure. This is what we're seeing as the preferred deployment model, particularly in Europe, but definitely in other areas around the world. Here I'm just showing you some analysis we did for Southeast Asia, looking at where industrial emissions clusters are, where they might be located near potential CO2 storage. Here we also show where projects are in development. But there are, these deployment pathways can play an important role in terms of scaling up CCUS rapidly, but also in a more cost-effective way. And finally, I've highlighted some priorities from the IEA in terms of being able to scale up CCUS consistent with our net zero pathway. I won't go into these in detail in the interest of time, but really creating those conditions for investment through direct support, through tax credits, for example, looking at shared infrastructure around industrial hubs, identifying and encouraging the development of CO2 storage, because this can really be a long lead time activity. And finally, boosting innovation to continue to refine technologies and reduce costs. And so with that, I'll leave it there and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Samantha. And your